Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Monk Chat. This evening, Ayasoma is not feeling well, so it's just the two of us, so Bhante Siddhaso and Bhante Jayasara. This will be his last appearance on the Buddhist Insights YouTube channel for the foreseeable future, though hopefully not the last time ever. We're always happy to have him with us, whether physically or remotely. So we'll start with Monk Chat using the usual ground rules for Monk Chat, which is that each person may ask up to 2 questions to start with. And once we've gone through all questions that have already been entered, then people can ask additional questions. So currently there's a couple of questions, so we'll go ahead and start with those. So Gita asks, how has Buddhism inspired you all? Well, that's a pretty broad question, so I think we can both answer this one. How has Buddhism inspired me? Well, first and foremost, it's inspired me with the possibility of enlightenment. That was actually the thing which got me the most excited in the very beginning, because before I started studying and practicing Buddhism, I had this strong urge, this really deep-seated need to come to a direct experiential understanding of the nature of reality. And also a deep need to try to figure out what happiness is and how to be happy. So discovering that Buddhism offers both of those things in a single package called enlightenment, and that it offers practical tools for attaining enlightenment, that was really wonderful. That brought me a lot of joy, a lot of inspiration. Yeah, so the possibility of enlightenment, the descriptions of enlightenment, the descriptions of enlightened beings, the clear path provided, that all inspired me quite a lot. That's the main thing that comes to mind. And otherwise, realistically, actually, the first thing that came to mind was, how has Buddhism inspired me? Well, everything about Buddhism is inspiring to me. It's all really wonderful, magnificent stuff that fills me with a lot of joy. What are your thoughts? How has Buddhism inspired you?
I would say that Buddhism has inspired me it's inspired me to live my life in such a way that kind of goes against society, that goes against what we think of as the norm, right? That kind of puts me on this quest, like to awakening, to seeking truth, to living a life that's not often lived, right? Taking the road that's not often taken. And the truths that I, have come across and I've learned through my path has continued to inspire me to the point that, this is, it's something that I'm quite happy that I'm doing, right? It inspires me that I am doing something that's not the norm, that I am seeking to try to better myself in ways that go much deeper than other ways that I've seen, right? One of the things that I love about Buddha calls the path to awakening, following the Noble Eightfold Path, the Adya Pariyesana, right? The noble quest, the noble search, right? And to me, that's a very inspiring thing, right? And to think about, the path that the Buddha and all those who've become awakened before me have followed, and that I can follow that path is just a very inspiring thing. Even in the day-to-day grind, where it's not exactly all that inspiring and frustrating and all these kind of things. In general, the inspiration to follow that noble quest is something that I essentially didn't know I needed in my life until it was there. So I guess that's my answer to that.
And Gita's second question, she says, how has Buddhism helped each of you personally in your life? Well, it's helped in basically every imaginable way. It's made me happier. It's made me kinder. It's made me saner. It's made me calmer. It's made me wiser. Basically every imaginable way. Also through monastic life, I've developed a lot of really useful skills, social skills, communication skills, leadership skills, as well as a lot of practical things. I learned how to cook, I learned how to sew, I learned how to use tools, lots of simple, practical things, ordinary life skills. Ultimately, Buddhism has helped me in that it's helped me develop the wholesome qualities that I find inspiring, the wholesome qualities that I find respectable and praiseworthy. So Buddhist practice has allowed me to become more and more like what I admire, more and more like what I respect in others.
All right. So basically pretty much everything Bhante said, but also I would say what it has done almost most of all is give me a meaning and a purpose that I didn't know I needed. I didn't know I wanted. It's, I would say that in addition to, almost as much as therapy and all the stuff that I did, to try to help me kind of have more meaning in my life and live a more meaningful life, the Buddhism was at least equal or more impactful in terms of me having a more peaceful, happy, and meaningful life. So I guess that's, how it's helped me, obviously, in addition to what we've said before.
Okay. And Adriana says, cool lighting, very intense. Well, we're using a different webcam today. So I don't know why it's producing this unusual lighting effect. So consider it a special bonus. And Bernadette asks, I am looking for the right school and teacher. How did you go about finding that for yourselves? And how did you know it was the right fit? So the answer is experimentation. So look at a lot of different forms of Buddhism, look at a lot of different schools and lineages and teachers, and see what really seems to work for you. See what really seems to help you. Oh, she clarifies, I should say looking for the right tradition. Again, study the different traditions, learn about them, investigate them, try them out, try out different practices and see what it feels like, see how it affects you, see what you feel an affinity with, and be willing to try out things which maybe you're not so interested in at the beginning. So for example, I was never much interested in Pure Land Buddhism, but the really transformative experience for me was when I was going to visit a monastery, and I had no idea that they were doing a 7-day Pure Land retreat. But I just walked in the monastery and they were like, guess what? We're doing a 7-day Pure Land retreat starting today and you're part of it. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing 7 days of intensive Pure Land practice. This will be a new experience. And it was mind-blowing. It was amazing. It was wonderful. I loved it. It was really transformative. It was a really powerful experience for me. Even though it was a Buddhist tradition that I had always thought was not my thing. It was a Buddhist tradition I'd always been completely uninterested in and actually quite averse towards for many years. But the experience of it was very, very opening. It showed me that there's depth and power to that tradition, which I had not previously been aware of. So yeah, try out different forms of Buddhism. Study them intellectually, of course, but also try them out and see what it feels like. Also, you don't necessarily need to pick a tradition. It's fine to practice with multiple traditions of Buddhism. There's kind of this pervasive myth going around that you need to just pick one tradition and only do that and nothing else. I don't know where this idea comes from. As far as I can tell, Buddhism is Buddhism, and it doesn't really make a big difference if you mix and match between different traditions. As long as you have a general understanding of the Noble Eightfold Path, a general understanding of the Four Noble Truths, a general understanding of what enlightenment is and how to get there, then you can use tools from any tradition and you'll keep moving in the right direction. I don't necessarily recommend mixing in elements from Hinduism because that's where people tend to get really confused. So Hinduism has practices which on the surface resemble Buddhist practice, but which are not, and which don't necessarily point in the same direction. So any tradition within Buddhism is fine. Mix and match, fine. But I don't recommend mixing in elements of Hinduism or else you might get very confused. So those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, exploration is important. You know, we, those of us, you know, who are kind of becoming Buddhist converts, we live in a time that is basically unmatched in this era of Dhamma in terms of like, we can literally like examine and explore and choose the type of Buddhism that fits us, right? Most, even only 50 years ago, like the, you know, people, you know, a lot of the senior Western monastics were basically hippies who kind of found their version of Buddhism wherever they were exploring, right? But now we can go on the internet and we can, you know, learn about we can hear different talks from different people and different traditions, and you know, and you can explore in that regard. So I think that's definitely a very beneficial thing. I will say though, you know, I'm actually a little bit more on the wary side in terms of mixing and matching traditions, only in the fact that you'd have to be very careful you don't move into kind of this spiritual window shopping where you kind of just mixing and matching and you like this, but this is kind of saying something, the same thing, you don't like that. And you know, that would be my only concern, is that you do have to make sure that, like Bhante said, you have this kind of very firm understanding of the core of the teachings, right? And there's a difference between like the teaching per se and like the practice and the way you would do it. Like, you know, you can have the same form, the same core, but different teachings just kind of have different interpretations and do things differently. And as long as you kind of have that basis of what the core is, then you should be okay. But you don't want to kind of, you know, kind of have it as, you know, all these things as like spiritual window dressing, right? You do really want to have a serious practice and a serious understanding of where you're going, so you don't, you know, lead yourself too far astray and you don't get into kind of all these other things, you know, that kind of take you away from the path. So that would be my only thing. There is, I think, a little bit of a wariness that should be there, in terms of making sure that if you are going to kind of mix and match, that you don't go too far off the trail.
Yeah, so it's I agree with what he's saying there. So Again, it's a bit like if you're a cook and you're following a recipe and you know that you can substitute one ingredient for another and still get basically the same results. Like maybe you're baking a cake and you know that the cake calls for honey, but you can replace the honey with maple syrup and it will still turn out fine. It won't get dramatically different results. But that's because you have the knowledge and understanding to know that the ingredients are interchangeable, more or less. Whereas, on the other hand, if you don't know what you're doing, then you might replace the honey with something completely different. You might replace it with ketchup. And then you're not going to have a good cake anymore. You're going to have a disaster. And you might think, well, it's a liquid, it's kind of sweet, I guess it works, but it doesn't. You're going to get a really bad cake. It's not going to work well at all. In fact, it might not even turn out properly, even close to properly. So in the same way, it's important to have a deep understanding of what the critical core elements of Buddhist practice are. And these critical core elements are pretty much the same across traditions. So this is why I emphasize the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, is that this is really the critical basis of practice. And also having some understanding of what enlightenment is, it helps to make sure we're pointing in the right direction. So one piece of advice I've sometimes heard, and this, you can be flexible on this, but one piece of advice I've heard is, in the beginning, shop around a bit, try out different things until you find one tradition that you feel a strong affinity for. And then take a while, like maybe several years, focusing most or all of your attention just on studying deeply and practicing deeply within that tradition, the one that you feel a strong affinity for. Then after you have a solid grounding in that tradition, then branch out and start exploring others more deeply. Again, not necessarily need to use this strategy, but for some people it seems to be helpful. Because another problem is that sometimes we catch only the superficial aspects of a tradition, but we miss their depth. So I see this especially with Zen practitioners. So Zen has a lot of very deep, profound teachings, which take a very long time to really understand. So it's easy to get caught up on the superficial outer layer and miss the underlying essence. And that can lead to really harmful conduct. But with sufficient time and dedication, you can understand what's going on there. Anyway, next question. Mark says, any thoughts on why some traditions in Buddhism, especially Tibetan, and some Hindu, insist that one needs a root guru? Well, I'm not going to talk about Hinduism because I don't practice Hinduism, so I think it's not really appropriate for me to talk about Hinduism. As for why some forms in Buddhism, and again, as far as I know, it's actually exclusively in Tibetan Buddhism that they do this. It's basically because if we rely only on our own opinions, the chances of us going astray are very high. Similarly, if we try to rely only on our own self-awareness, we're likely to get lost in major blind spots. So we do want to really watch out for that. And this is one of the values of having a root guru. So the idea of the root guru is that this is your teacher who you always go back to and ask questions of and ask for advice. And theoretically, you're supposed to follow their advice unquestioningly. In actuality, a little bit of questioning is fine because that helps you understand. But the idea is that if your root guru says something, you take it really seriously. You don't set it aside lightly. And again, that's to prevent people from making really critical mistakes in believing their own opinions, in following their own defilements. Where it gets into some difficult territory is if you select a root guru who's not such a great character, someone who has major unwholesome tendencies, someone who has serious flaws in their wisdom, serious gaps in their morality, then really bad things happen. And it doesn't take a whole lot of searching. Just type in Tibetan Buddhism controversy, and you'll find no end of examples on why it's important to be extremely selective about your root guru. So it's kind of like getting married to someone. You don't just walk out on the street and just pick a random person and be like, we're getting married. You put some real consideration into what you're doing, in theory. In actuality, people clearly don't, because the divorce rate is 50%. So clearly, maybe this isn't the best example. But yeah, you want to be really careful. If you're going to get into that root guru relationship with somebody, be really careful to vet the person carefully beforehand. So one saying that you might hear is that you should investigate a teacher for 10 years before designating them as your guru. And actually, I think that's maybe even a little on the quick side. But I am firmly grounded in Theravada, which doesn't have this concept of the root guru at all. Instead, teachers are regarded as friends, as spiritual friends who offer advice and guidance. But we're not obligated to follow their advice. We're not obligated to believe their guidance, but they're helpful from time to time. And also in the Chan tradition, there's a bit stronger of an emphasis on one's teacher, but there's still the recognition that you have to work out your own awakening within yourself, and that nobody can hand it to you. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Do you have anything to add?
I have no experience with Tibetan or gurus, so I have nothing skillful to add. No.
Okay, and so Jen is saying, the only temple that's close to my home is a Vietnamese Mahayana Pure Land temple. I've grown to love it and our abbot. So thankful for the wonderful translators they have to accommodate us. Yeah, so it's really, this is another reason why it's really good to be open to different forms of Buddhism, is that sometimes you will, your options might be limited in terms of what's available. So if you are insistent on like, well, I must have this specific form of Buddhism with this specific lineage, with this specific style of teacher, well, that just might not be available. In fact, it probably won't be. But if you look for the good in any Buddhist tradition, you'll probably find it. That said, there are some weird fringe groups on the outskirts of Buddhism, which are good to be wary of. For more details, send me an email. But there are 2 or 3 groups which call themselves Buddhist, but which teach very different doctrines, which are not Orthodox, Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, but they've created their own thing, which is not in line with the Buddhist teachings. But they go by the name Buddhism. So there are some groups like that. Again, send me an email and we can talk about more on that subject if you wish. Let's see, Jens asks, with Nekama, would you say there is an aspect of weariness, not depression, but a dissatisfaction with the idea that engaging with samsara will bring peace? What you're referring to is called Sangha in Pali. That world weariness, the recognition that samsara brings no peace, no solace, that's Sangha. So Sangha is this recognition that there's nothing in samsara worth pursuing or getting caught up in, except for the path to awakening. There's also an element of disenchantment there. So with disenchantment, similarly, we see that the pretty things of the world are not worth the effort. They're not worth getting caught up in. So Sangha and disenchantment both help us to develop renunciation. They both help us to develop this willingness to let go, this mind of non-attachment. And ultimately, nekkhamma is what brings us to enlightenment. Because the final stage of nekkhamma is renunciation of our sense of self, letting go of self. So those are my thoughts. Do you have any comments?
No, yeah, I think you explained it well. Like nekkhamma literally means like letting go, abandoning, right? And so because of our attachments to things, we actually have to develop that samvega, that nibbida, viraga, to actually be able to start to really let go of things. So, nekkhamma is something that we practice, in terms of our right thought, right intention. And it is something that becomes much easier as we develop our insight and we develop our dispassion and disenchantment for those things that we are attached to.
And Mark Sarin is asking, any recommendation for a top-notch Pali dictionary, hopefully on the web? Unfortunately, there is no complete top-notch Pali dictionary. There is a medium-notch Pali dictionary, which is complete. It's called the Pali English Dictionary by Rice, Davids, and Steed. So if you just look up Pali English Dictionary, it's usually the first one you'll find. It's okay, but it has some flaws and drawbacks, but it's the best complete option out there. There's a newer dictionary called A Dictionary of Pali by Margaret Cohn. However, it's not complete. It's a 4-volume set, and they've released the first 2 or 3 volumes. But it's turning out to be much better than the old Rice, Davids, and Steed dictionary. So Dictionary of Pali by Margaret Cohn. That's a great one, but again, it's not complete. There's also kind of like third choice would be Buddhadatta Mahathera's concise Pali English dictionary, but that one's not very good at all, to be honest. It's quite insufficient and inaccurate, but it's kind of your last choice. Its main benefit is that it does have some rare words that you won't find in the Rice, Davids, and Steed dictionary. But once Margaret Cohn's dictionary is done, then I would say that will be the top resource. It's very thorough, it's very complete, it's very accurate. I'm a big fan of it. It's just not finished yet.
Is the PED the Rice Davids one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the PED, the Pali English Dictionary by Rice, Davids, and Steed, that's kind of the go-to dictionary. And it's pretty good for the most part, but as one's knowledge of Buddhism and knowledge of Pali develops, then it starts to become clear that it's not perfect. And it's not the best. Yeah.
This new one that you mentioned, is this available like in digital form at all, or is it just?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay.
No. It's available in large, heavy hardcover books that are quite pricey.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
it's probably why I've never heard of it.
I mean, we don't have a complete set here, but I have 1 volume of it downstairs. My dream is to have a complete set one of these days. Anyway, Bernadette asks, do other forms of Buddhism not require a guru? Actually, most forms of Buddhism don't require a guru. It's really only Tibetan Buddhism that requires it. And even then, there's some flexibility around that. And honestly, I think the main reason for that is because Tibetan Buddhist practices can be very complex and complicated, and also very easy to misunderstand. It's actually the same with Theravada and Mahayana, just much less so. Theravada is much more straightforward. And Pure Land and Chan are also pretty straightforward. So you don't necessarily need a guru. But with all forms of Buddhism, it's helpful to have teachers who you ask advice from time to time. This is in the suttas, actually. The Buddha in the suttas says that it's important from time to time to go to senior monastics and ask them questions. This is part of what allows the arising of wisdom. Okay. Anything?
No, I was going to say, like, yeah, you can see in the suttas, you don't really see like a one like, because the monks were traveling a lot, what you kind of see and understand, and what, as far as I can understand, what the Buddha is encouraging is like, you're living in a village, right? And, one day then, Sariputta is there, right? And you learn from him and you listen to Dhamma talks from him. And then the next day a bhikkhuni comes, or, and a Padachara comes. And then the next day, or the next week, Mahamoggallana comes. So you're like actually getting this broad depth of, different teachings from, different teachers and things like that. And so you're getting that chance. And so anytime that you have the ability, the chance to listen to Dhamma, then you would do it, because this is, you're, just a regular person in your village. And essentially you can't really do much traveling to find Dhamma, but the Dhamma can come to you. And so this is the kind, what I understand and what I can see in the early suttas, this is how it was, right? You're not really, there's later on that there's like city monks and things like that, but for the most part, there's not going to be one monk that's going to stay right there that you're going to learn from, exclusively over time. They're going to be wandering, they're going to be hanging out in the woods, all these kind of things. So
yeah, I mean, ultimately the Dhamma is our teacher, and the different teachers that we encounter are to help us understand the Dhamma. Yeah. So Jen asks, would you be willing to explain a little about Padmasambhava? I hear people call him the second Buddha. Was he enlightened like Siddhartha Gautama? So Padmasambhava is a semi-legendary figure, very popular in Tibetan Buddhism. He was a Buddhist monk from northern India who successfully established Buddhism in Tibet. So there were some previous attempts to bring Buddhism to Tibet before him, but those attempts failed. Padmasambhava was the first one who was successful. So he successfully started the first major Buddhist lineage in Tibet. And the reason why they call him the second Buddha is because the idea was, well, the first Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama started Buddhism in India. And then Padmasambhava was the guy who started Buddhism in Tibet. So he's like the Buddha of Tibet. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the title second Buddha because realistically, he's not a Buddha by definition. So by definition, a Samma Sambuddha, there's only one per world system until that Buddha is forgotten. So anybody who attains enlightenment after the first Buddha would be called an arhat. Though you sometimes do hear the term Anu-Buddha, which means following a Buddha. So a Buddha following another Buddha. So Anu-Buddha or Buddhanu-Buddha is a term that's synonymous with arhat. So somebody who attains awakening following the instructions of another Buddha. So Padmasambhava, again, reputedly was in fact fully enlightened, but he would have been what we call an arhat. We wouldn't necessarily call him a Buddha, and he definitely wasn't a Samma Sambuddha. That said, it's important to note that the word arhat is defined differently in Tibetan Buddhism than it is in the rest of the Buddhist world. So in Theravada and most forms of Mahayana, an arhat is a fully enlightened being. But in Tibetan Buddhism, they define the word arhat differently in a way that refers to somebody who's not fully enlightened, but has made progress along the path, but isn't all the way there. So you will encounter this difference. But yeah, in Theravada and Mahayana terms, we would call Padmasambhava an arhat. We would not call him a Buddha. Bradley is asking, do you have any thoughts on that? No. Okay. There's a lot of fun stories with Padmasambhava about him going around subjugating various demons in Tibet and so on, and might be true, might not be, I don't know. I think most likely Padmasambhava was just a very well-developed monk who established Buddhism in Tibet, and then all these fun legends developed around him. So Bradley asks, how would you translate joyful heart to Pali as a name? There's several different ways you could do it. I recommend sending me an email, and I could give you some possibilities. So I'm also curious why. Why are you interested in coming up with Pali names? Idle curiosity, or is there something else going on? Let me know. And that's the last question we have for now. So we still have plenty of time. So anybody who has more questions, even if you've already asked several questions, please go ahead and enter in some more questions. Otherwise, if there's no more questions, then we'll go ahead and end for the evening. Great, here's another question. And while we answer this question, I'd encourage other people to write more questions so that we can keep going. Julia asks, what are some Buddhist practices you'd recommend as an antidote to low self-esteem, self-judgment, self-criticism? Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. I don't know, and I'll leave this to Bhante if he has any. I don't know if there's any specific practices for self-judgment, self-criticism. But what I will say is that the deeper you go into the practice and you start to understand what your mind is doing, like you sit down and I'm gonna meditate, and then let me follow my breath. And then 2 seconds later, you lose your breath. You couldn't even sit still and follow your breath for a minute, right? And then the judgments start to come. Oh, I'm a bad meditator, this or that, right? And all this kind of typical self-judgment and self-criticism arises, right? And over time, you start to notice that, and you start to observe it, and you start to see, well, why am I doing this to myself, right? It's, you kind of have to, the more you understand your mind, right, there's less judgment, there's less criticism. Oh, this is just the way the mind is, right? The mind is crazy. The mind is, interesting. The mind does all kinds of things, right? So once you start to understand, once you start to see how things are, then the self-judgment, the self-criticism really starts to kind of, starts to slowly fade away. It doesn't go away permanently, but it's really kind of it's a side effect of the practice, especially as you start to understand a little bit, into, not self, where you start to, question and you start to reflect, well, is this me? Is this mine? Is this myself? Like for your thoughts or things that arise, it's like, is this criticism me? Right? Do I have to identify this as mine? Do I have to accept that? Right? Do I have to feel bad because this criticism has arisen in my mind? Right? Why do we? So the more you work with your mind, the more you understand your mind, that is the antidote. The antidote is wisdom and insight, right? Because then when you understand, like, why am I so hard on myself? Why do I, have such low self-esteem for myself? Why do I, have so much trouble? Why do I hate myself? Why do I this? Why do I all that? Why do I have all this judgment? Then you start to understand, you start to let go. And you said, this is very peaceful. Like, why am I beating myself over the head? It's like for all this time, you've just been, beating yourself over the head, and you start to realize, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for? Right? And then you just start to let it go. Right? And when that little criticism comes up, right? The judgment comes up, you can reflect on it. Like, is this legitimate? Or is this over the top? Should I reflect on this and use this? Maybe I am doing something unskillful, that there is a judgment or criticism that's accurate, right? Maybe that is a technique you can do. If a criticism arises or a judgment arises, question, well, is this accurate or not? Is this needed or not? Or is this just over the top? Right? Or is this just actually harming me? Or is this a valid criticism that maybe I should actually use this to better myself? But for the most part, we just have this, at least in my mind, what I notice is just in the beginning, especially, such a very strong self-critical, self-judgmental. And because I was that way for myself, I was that way for other people too. People suck, and people are a virus, and people are this, and people are that. And I was, oh, wait, okay. Less judgment and self-criticism for myself, less judgment and criticism for others, right? So as part of the practice, when a thought arises, when a judgment or a self-criticism arises, don't just accept it. Question it, investigate it. Is there validity to this or not? And if there's not, you say, okay, I'm just going to let this go.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's great advice. Just one small thing I would add. So one practice the Buddha recommends is called silanusati, which is recollection of your own goodness. So recollection of your own virtues, your own generosity, your own good qualities. So Buddhism is not about always trying to fixate on bad qualities about yourself. In fact, quite the opposite. Cultivating the habit of reminding yourself of your good qualities and delighting in your goodness. So that's a much more wholesome way of approaching the practice. So Bernadette asks, why do we see women scarcely represented in Buddhism as monks and teachers? Where do you see diversity going in Buddhism? Do you see more inclusion on the horizon? The Buddha's teachings themselves are actually quite inclusive. There's a number of suttas where the Buddha quite clearly states that things like gender and race are not determining factors in someone's spiritual qualities. But nonetheless, the institutions of Buddhism over the last 2,500 years have mostly been created by unenlightened people, which means that they have reflected the delusions and prejudices of unenlightened people, which means that there's a lot of patriarchy, there's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of oppression, there's a lot of prejudice present in the Buddhist institutions that have been going on for the last 2,500 years. That has nothing to do with the Buddha's teachings. It has to do with unenlightened people creating institutions based on their own delusions and prejudices. But that's caused the issues that you're speaking to. The fact that, especially in the Theravada and Vajrayana traditions, there's very few female monks. There's quite a lot in the Mahayana traditions, by the way. So for example, if you go to Taiwan, which is basically the epicenter of Orthodox Mahayana Buddhism these days, there's 6 times as many female monks as male. And lots of them are amazingly good teachers. So they do exist. But yeah, centuries upon centuries of patriarchal misogyny has definitely caused some serious damage to the female side of Buddhism. And that's starting to change these days. In the last 100 years or so, it's started to see a shift, especially in the last 50 years. There's been started to be a major shift in a positive direction. It's been an ongoing problem. It's very unfortunate, but it's the way things are. But it's the way things are changing. Diversity going in Buddhism, it's getting better. More inclusion, absolutely. Maybe not as quickly as we would like, but we're getting there. Yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say when I see like represented, I'm I'm wondering if, like, as monks and teachers, I'm wondering if part of what Bernadette is meaning is also is kind of like in the sphere for not, for Buddhist converts, or like in the West, like in America, like what's available, like online and things like that. And there's not that many, I'm friends with a bunch of bhikkhunis on Facebook, so I see their videos and things like that. But one of the things I would suggest is, well, if you like a certain, bhikkhuni or female monastic or whatever, encourage them to get online, encourage them to do a YouTube channel, encourage them to, put their talks online, stuff like that. So then you could have more diversity available for people to explore of Buddhism, on YouTube and videos and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. So one of the problems that is still going on these days is that male monastics get far more support than female monastics. So that's another thing I would suggest. Find out about some female Buddhist monasteries and start supporting them. Send them donations. Go and stay with them for a while and help out with their work projects. Encourage other people to support them. This is how things start to change. So there's a number of places, especially on the West Coast, there's a number of places I could speak about. So Alokavihara, Karunavihara, Dhammadharani, those are a few that come to mind. Heartwood Refuge in North Carolina. Yeah, there's a few places. Yep. Gita asks, Bhante, how can we train our mind to develop stillness or single-pointedness in meditation? Is it a matter of practice and training, continuous daily practice? Well, continuous daily meditation practice, of course. Generally speaking, the more meditation, the better. If you want to get strong samadhi, more is better. Also practicing very intensely. So when you meditate, really put a lot of effort into your meditation. Don't space out, really make a strong effort. But actually, often the single most important determiner of our samadhi, the strength of our stillness and mental unification in meditation, is actually nothing to do with what we're doing in our meditation. The single most important determiner is what we're doing the time that we're not meditating. What are we doing the rest of the day? The rest of the day, if we're spacing out and thinking about random things and watching TV and listening to music and arguing with people and scrolling through Facebook for hours on end, then yeah, we're going to have really bad samadhi, pretty much guaranteed. But if you live a very quiet, simple, peaceful life and you maintain constant mindfulness and equanimity as you go throughout your day, then even if you're only doing an hour or two of meditation a day, you'll have quite good samadhi. Okay, anything else? Eva asks, is there a way to know if one has attained stream entry? Yes. So a few weeks ago, I gave a talk on the Kosambhya Sutta. So the Kosambhya Sutta is a discourse which speaks about the 7 factors of a stream enterer, which combined with the 3 fetters abandoned by a stream enterer, you have a total of 10 characteristics. So a checklist of 10 qualities to see if you're a stream enterer. If you can check off all 10, you're almost certainly a stream enterer. Most people, they look at that list and they're like, oh, I have a ways to go, quite a ways to go. So you can check that out. Okay, anything?
Oh, I just... there's a lot of ways we can delude ourselves in the practice. Like, oh, I've become awakened, or oh, I'm a stream enterer, or oh, I've been in jhanas and things like that. And it's always good, like Bhante, actually, I think that's a good thing to, this checklist of things, observing that. But it's also, I think, good to have a bit of just a little bit of doubt. Maybe I haven't. Like, one thing that Bhante Gunaratana, Bhante G says, like, if you have to ask if you're a stream enterer, then you're not.
Yeah.
Bhante G basically says, like, you will know when you become a stream enterer. So it's one of those things where, we look to the suttas, to the explanations, and then we If you have doubts, if there's a little bit of doubt, right? Because, well, one of the things that a stream mentor abandons is doubt, right? So if you have doubt that you have no more doubts, then you're probably not a stream mentor. So.
And Jens asks, what are common misconceptions of Buddhism you have encountered from non-practitioners? Oh, the list goes on and on and on and on. Do you want to mention a few?
Oh, I've actually had the idea to literally make a book about common misconceptions for Westerners and things like that.
Yeah, it just never ends.
Well, one of the biggest misconceptions, at least for monasticism, is that we just get to kind of be in the woods and meditate all day. And I think a lot of us monastics really wouldn't mind that. But that's actually something it seems to me to be something that's pretty rare. It does exist, but there's a lot of misconceptions about monasticism. There's also a lot of misconceptions about karma. There's tons because especially in the karma has kind of entered into the Western lingo for some, in various ways, but there's a lot of things that people who aren't Buddhists, they think of karma that we just know that that's not the case. Karma, as being some kind of cosmic judge, and all these kind of things. There's a lot of misconceptions on how karma works and stuff like that.
Two common misconceptions, which are kind of polar opposite. One misconception is thinking that the Buddha is our God, which is not true. The Buddha himself directly stated that he's not a God. Or the opposite viewpoint is people thinking that Buddhism is atheist. That's also not quite correct. Or people think that Buddhism is polytheistic, and that's also not quite correct. So a lot of the misconceptions that people get comes from trying to fit Buddhism into the framework of other religious systems or philosophical systems rather than approaching it on its own ground. But yeah, again, I could just sit here and list for hours all the weird things people have told me about Buddhism, which I then had to correct them on. Next, Pete asks, could you compare and contrast the approaches of Ajahn Chah's tradition with Bhavana Society? I'm not really sure that's a useful question, to be perfectly honest. For one thing, Bhavana Society is one monastery, whereas the Ajahn Chah tradition encompasses hundreds of monasteries. And even within those hundreds of monasteries, there's a fair amount of variety. So I'm not really sure that's a terribly useful question. Yeah. I'm kind of just get past that one.
Yeah, it is kind of, it's almost apples and oranges.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to.
Yeah, but also you will find some monasteries within the Ajahn Chah tradition that resemble many traits of Bhavana Society. But yeah, apples and oranges, I agree. It's not quite a question, I understand. So Brown in Your Face, which is an interesting name. So Brown in Your Face, I'll just call you Brown from now on. So Brown says, hello, I am not knowledgeable on the entirety of the Buddhist scriptures, but I follow the Theravada teachings, and most teachers say the Abhidhamma is not necessary. Is there info in the Mahayana Sutta? Is there info in the later suttas like the Abhidhamma that Buddha didn't teach at first that make a modern practice more complete? Complete is not the right word, but insights that can lead to liberation faster or make a modern practice easier? Well, you try it out for yourself and see what happens. Some people, they find Abhidhamma has some really interesting things which help to clarify their understanding of Buddhist practice. Same with Mahayana. I find a lot of the Mahayana teachings to be really powerful ways of clarifying or expanding on the Theravada system. But then other people, they look at the Abhidhamma and they just see a bunch of mental proliferation that just doesn't seem to go anywhere useful. And some people, they look at the Mahayana Sutras and it just seems like a bunch of wasted words. So your mileage may vary. So I would say try it out, look into it. But most importantly, see, how can I apply this to my practice? Is there something here which is of benefit and support to my practice? Thoughts? Okay. Jen says, yes, I get that.
It's a hypothetical question, but it's technically not a hypothetical question because
if Buddhism, so Jen asks, if Buddhism was the law of the land, how would we deal with violence or rioting or criminals, etc.? Basically, what would the justice system be? Would it be possible? So the Buddha doesn't go into a lot of detail on this, but he does touch on it in a handful of suttas. I actually gave a talk on this a few weeks back. I think it's called something like Buddhism and Politics or something like that. Yeah, briefly, what the Buddha actually speaks about is removing the underlying causes for violence and criminal activity in the first place. So establishing an equitable society with a strong social welfare network. This is the basic recommendation that the Buddha makes in a few different suttas. As for the justice system, again, the Buddha actually doesn't go into that at all. But there are a couple places where he says that giving harsh punishments to criminals is ineffective. That harshly punishing criminals does not address the problems that underlie crime, and that it can actually make the problem worse. So again, the recommendations he gives are to address the underlying causes of criminality using compassion and generosity. That's what he recommends. These days, people are sharing a lot of interesting ideas on how to reform the justice system and how to reform the police system in a way which would be actually more in line with what the Buddha was talking about. So applying compassion and generosity and fairness to try to remove the underlying causes for harmful behaviors to happen in the first place.
And of course, this question is essentially, I guess what's not asked is, this is essentially what would be the ideal Buddhist kind of law of the land, because we have multiple Buddhist countries in the world today, and you could essentially look at what they do. So in that regard, it's not necessarily a hypothetical question, but if we're looking for the ideal, then it would make sense. Or you could just kind of look at what the wheel-turning monarch would do, which is essentially...
That's what I would recommend, because actually, if you look at the legal systems in modern Buddhist countries, they're not really dramatically different from the legal system in any other country, which is a bit disappointing, because they have this wonderful treasure, which is the Buddhist teachings, and they somehow forgot to look at that stuff when they were coming up with their legal system. So it's a bit disappointing, kind of a missed opportunity.
It's called reality. There's always a difference between the ideal and the reality, right?
Yeah. So the wheel-turning monarch is a great example. So the wheel-turning monarch is the ideal ruler, and they run their government based upon the 5 precepts, based upon the principles of compassion, non-violence, non-harming, welfare. So that's spoken about in a number of places in the suttas. But that's not what you see in Buddhist countries. In Buddhist countries, you just see the usual oppression and profiteering that you see in every other country. But that's because the wheel-turning monarch is also a morally perfect person, whereas most governments are not run by morally perfect people.
If you want to know if you're living in a land that has a wheel-turning monarch, look up to the sky and see if there's a big wheel turning in the sky. If there's no big wheel turning in the sky, then you're not living under a wheel-turning monarch. That's an easy
Now
way.
we could get into theories as to what the wheel in the sky represents. I've got a couple theories which we can talk about after this. So let's see. Gabriela asks, what constitutes the major distinction between the three of you in your approaches to meditation practice? Well, unfortunately, Ayasoma is not with us. So that's a euphemism for dead, but that's not how I mean it. But then she's not here in the room with us right now, so she can't give her answer. Difference in your approaches to meditation practice? Well, it's probably easier just to say what our meditation practice is, if you don't mind. Yeah, so I do a little bit of metta every day, but the majority of my practice is samadhi. So developing samadhi through long periods of sitting meditation with trying to keep the body completely still and the mind very sharply focused on mindfulness of the body. So that's my main samadhi practice. Then my main insight practice is the recognition of impermanence, which I usually do after developing samadhi for most of my time. Once in a while, I use some other methods. Sometimes I use the 6 elements as another way of developing insight, particularly the perception of not self. There's a handful of other methods that I use more rarely, but those are the main ones that I use. Yeah.
Your approaches to meditation practice. Well, I think, our proclivities and tendencies kind of mold our meditation practice, right? Even like for instance, what I try to do is I try to follow, the basic main teaching practices that the Buddha gives in the suttas. So, like developing samadhi by practicing mindfulness of breathing, practicing, trying to, when I'm off the cushion, trying to always practice satipatthana practices, foundations of mindfulness practices. And also metta, mindfulness of death, and walking meditation, all these kind of different practices. And for me, what I would say is because sitting and breathing and all these kind of things never came too easy for me. I guess in many ways, my practice led more towards kind of like really focusing on practicing mindfulness in all my activities and things like that. But I never stopped doing my mindfulness of breathing per se, at least not after, once I really understood the importance of it in the suttas and things like that. But we all kind of have our own things where we more easily lean towards one than the other, right? And that's kind of, I think that would be probably any of the major differences, in our practices, as opposed to like major doctrinal differences or anything like that. It's more like what has worked the best for us and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's important to have a sense of, one's affinities, one's strengths and weaknesses, and what one needs to work on, but also what practices one is good at. So if we only focus on doing meditation practices that are difficult for us, that can be very discouraging. So it's good to have some sense of what practices we can do with some ease and comfort. So we can always return to that. But also have some sense as to what we need to work on developing and not to completely neglect working on our weak spots as well. So Gabriela's second question, she says, I do a dirty job and work with some difficult people. Do you live in a monastery? What is your advice on removing disgust and contempt? Well, first off, reflect on the drawbacks. recognize that disgust and contempt are very unpleasant states of mind. They're not happy states of mind. They're very uncomfortable states of mind. And recognize that they're optional. They're things that you're doing, which means you can stop doing them. And sometimes this is all it takes. We recognize I'm hurting myself. I can stop. Maybe I'll stop. And then we stop. That's the ideal. You can also work on cultivating gratitude. Gratitude for the fact that you have a job, for example. A lot of people don't have jobs these days. A lot of people are unemployed. A lot of people actually have no income at all, not even government benefits, because for one reason or another, they're not eligible. So be grateful that you even have a job. That's great. You're working with difficult people. Well, be grateful that they're helping you learn equanimity. Be grateful that they're helping you learn tolerance. It's pretty wonderful. And also, again, cultivate compassion. Usually when somebody else is hard to be with, hard to be around, it's because they are filled with dukkha. And they're expressing that dukkha by being unpleasant to others, by being not so nice to deal with. So also try to bring up compassion for them, compassion for the dukkha that they're experiencing. And of course, do loving kindness meditation every day. That helps tremendously. A few years ago, I decided that I needed to do something about my aversive tendencies. And I started doing at least a few minutes of metta every day, and it has radically changed my mind. It's radically changed my heart. It really works. Do metta every day. Those are my thoughts. Do you have any thoughts?
I guess the only thing I would add to the whole disgust thing, the disgust mechanism is very strong, right? And so what I would say is, if you're having a job where you have to do some disgusting things, you can reflect, like I'm fully protected, and maybe I'm wearing my gloves or my mask or whatever, just trying to reflect on the steps that you're taking to minimize any concerns that would come with that disgust mechanism, right? And reflecting on that. And other than that, you can use disgust as an object of your meditation and really investigate that disgust. Why has it arisen? Why does it come? And investigate how the disgust mechanism really affects you physically and things like that. Like, I have a real disgust with animal hair and things like that. And it's like, right? So that's been something that I've reflected on, why this is just a hair, it's not going to kill me, these kind of things. So reflecting on the disgust and all of that, we've gone really. Okay, there we go.
I'm trying to make it better, but it's actually getting worse.
Yeah. We're almost over. Yeah, that's actually better. Yeah, that's a little better. Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to improve the lighting. Just give me one moment. Okay.
I think that'll be better, at least for the little time we have left.
That's slightly better. Yeah, sorry about the lighting problems today. Hopefully this won't happen again. Okay, where were we? I think we're to here. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So AP says, why learn Pali language when an English translation of the suttas is available? Because no translation is ever complete. No translation is ever perfectly accurate. Translations can be good, but they can never be perfect. So for those who want to really get a deep, thorough understanding of the Dhamma, learning Pali is very helpful because it allows you to get closer to the full, complete, perfect meaning of the Buddha's words?
At minimum, if you don't want to learn Pali, at least take all of the major terms and understand why different translators translate in different ways and things like that. At least allow yourself to investigate the major terms like sankhara, like karma, like dukkha, all these kind of things. At the very least, do a study of the major terms and their definition and their roots, and why different translators will translate things differently. That should be, if you're interested in the suttas and reading the suttas and using the suttas as a framework, that's a minimum.
So Brown asks, question about the precepts. I have avoided relationships and intimacy. If I don't know what it's like, then it will be easier to battle cravings. I've used cannabis for almost half my life, but now that I'm stopping for the precepts, my question is if it's okay to follow sexual cravings to avoid intoxication. Well, optimally, you'll avoid both. So celibacy is actually a great practice. And of course, it's the central element of monastic life. But also some devout lay practitioners will also follow celibacy as a practice. And optimally, we're trying to not get caught up in any kind of craving. So whether it's craving for sexual activity or craving for intoxicants or craving for anything at all, actually. But those are two very strong forms of craving, which tend to dominate the mind in a very harmful and obsessive way. So actually, I think that continuing with celibacy is probably a great idea. It's really not worth getting wrapped up in sexuality if you've already been successfully practicing celibacy for a while. Those are my thoughts. Anything?
Well, I don't know if I'm reading into it, but I almost kind of detect a little bit of a strong aversion, trying to fight it kind of a thing, more than trying to understand it and be skillful with it. I mean, if you do want to kind of, in a way, live more like a monastic in your lay life, and you are trying to be celibate and all that, then yeah, you can, use the same techniques and understandings and practices as a monastic. But what I don't think is good, I don't think you should be wary of developing a strong aversion or dislike that you have sexual cravings, because that is aversion. That's not insight. That's not understanding, right? So you should also understand that this is natural, that this is, you have this body, this is what's going to happen, and then you work with it. So it's like that your question is, right, I've been using this drug to cope with me trying to avoid my sexual cravings. Now I'm trying to not use this drug, and now my cravings are here and I can't cope with them. Can I abandon this and go into it, right? So it's kind of, I don't know if I'm being the most skillful in explaining this, but I think I would be wary of being too averse and negative in terms of what is part of your experience, right? If you're trying to be celibate and these things, that's good, but try to be celibate, right? Try to work with your lust and really understand your sexuality and all these kind of things, as opposed to trying to kind of escape it by doing something else, right? Because then once that other thing is not there anymore, then you have no insight, no wisdom into your sexuality, and it's just a matter of willpower, and your willpower is going to fall, right? So really, understand and investigate and know it, and use the Subha techniques and the various techniques that that the Buddha gives to work with lust and things like that. But if you're trying to escape it and avoid it, you're not going to be able to do it forever. So it's better to understand it.
I would also say that often it's better to gradually ramp up our practice rather than try to jump directly into very high standards for ourselves all at once. So you might consider taking a more gradual, gentle approach to your practice. And Gita asks, Bante asks, which volumes are you missing on Pali translations? Send me an email and I'll let you know what the situation is. Basically, I'm missing a couple volumes from the Margaret Cohn Dictionary of Pali. Gabriella says, knowing Pali made me seriously love the Buddha as a person, as he was actually a pretty funny guy. Actually, that's another reason to learn Pali, is there's a tremendous amount of humor and personality and quirkiness packed into the Buddha's teachings, which is almost entirely lost in translation. But you get it when you read the suttas in Pali. You're just like, oh, I see what he's doing here. Oh, okay. It's often really cute or quirky or clever or funny. But you just don't get that in translations. And Gabrielle is pointing out that actually much of the Khuddaka Nikaya is not yet translated into English. That's correct. Or in some cases, the only translations available are very old and not very accurate. Also, Gabriella points out the Digha Nikaya was not done by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Yeah, so the Digha Nikaya translation also is quite old and not very good. And also the translation style that the translator used for the Digha Nikaya was very dodgy. Yeah, it's not the greatest. So Brown says, I want to live monk life, so I have a strong aversion. How to be celibate without aversion successfully. Yeah, so it's not about aversion. So being celibate is not about aversion to sexuality. It's not about hating sexuality. It's just recognizing that there is no solace in sexuality. There's no contentment. Oh, there's a sutta where actually a few places, where the Buddha just says very directly, he says, you can never find contentment in sexuality. No matter how much sex you have, you will never be satisfied with it, ever. So the celibate mind arises not from aversion to sexuality, but rather from a deep, wise recognition that there is no comfort to be found in it. It's just a bottomless hole, a bottomless pit. And you can never fill it up. You can never be satisfied. And yes, AP, I know about Maurice Walsh's Digha Nikaya, and I don't like it at all. At all, sorry. Bhante Sujato's is better. But yeah, Maurice Walsh's is not the greatest. Yeah. And it looks like that's the end of the questions. So if there's no other questions, we're almost at 9 o'clock anyway, so maybe that will be it for the evening. So thank you everyone for joining in and for tolerating the low visual fidelity. Oh, more questions. Julia asks, what is your most recommended Theravada Sutta and Mahayana Sutra? Teachings that had a deep impact on you and you think might be of benefit to others too. Thank you. Most recommended Theravada Sutta, well, I mean, the whole Pali Canon is actually pretty good. Mahasatipatthana Sutta is kind of a classic because it's very thorough. I personally really like the Kachana Gota Sutta, which is a very short one, but it's hard to understand it if you don't already have a good grasp of all the other suttas. So if I had to pick one, I would probably say Mahasatipatthana Sutta. It's very thorough. Favorite Mahayana Sutra? The Heart Sutra is a classic. It's very short and very profound, but similar to the Kachanagota Sutta, without a thorough understanding of the Buddhist teachings, the Heart Sutra doesn't make much sense. I'm also a big fan of the Diamond Sutra. The Diamond Sutra is great, though also not easy to understand without a thorough knowledge of the Buddhist teachings. Yeah, that's what comes to mind for me. Anything? Favorite sutra?
Yeah, no, but Mahasatipatthana was going to be that for me as well.
Yeah.
Man, that, it's a summary of sati. I mean, it's the practice, the toolbox. So yeah, that is the one that I would give. I'm a big fan of. I like a lot of the. Not the words theoretical is probably not the best word, but my favorite suttas are ones that give practical teachings and practical tools, like something that you can actually be like, okay, well, tomorrow or even later today, I'm going to start putting this into practice. Like the Buddha is giving you an actual practical tool to do, right? It's not like something you have to kind of read and you kind of have to sort of understand and you need to hear, 10 monks talk about it. And then you're like, okay, now I know what to do. But no, like suttas where the Buddha's, it's so straightforward, so practical, so pragmatic, and you can do it right away. Right. And like, so Satipatthana, although actually that does need, some parts do need some good explanation and understanding, but there's also parts that you can do right away. Right. Satipatthana is one of those things where you can be a Buddhist practitioner 10 years. And the more you read it and the more you learn about it, you still learn more. It's not something like, everything after 2 years and then that's it. So it's a lifelong sutta. So yeah, that one.
Great. And that's the end of the questions. So we'll go ahead and close for the evening. So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next week.